So today's webinar, using Rocket Phonics effectively with learners who have more complex special educational needs and disabilities, SEND. In this session, we will have a whistle-stop tour. So if you've been to one of my webinars before, they tend to be pretty packed. We get through quite a lot of content in our hour. And so we will be touching upon some let's get thinking, some reflective questions that you can discuss later with your colleagues or think about yourself. We will explore what we mean by SEND and why we focus on barriers and not labels, the complex processes involved in learning to read and write, why phonics still matters for all learners, including those with profound multiple learning difficulties, PMLD, how to balance fidelity, keyword in phonics is having that fidelity to your program with flexibility when adapting your Rocket Phonics to meet your learners' needs, some practical strategies for adapting materials without diluting the learning, an example of inclusive practice using Rocket Phonics resources, and some final reflections. So that's our plan for today. So I like to open webinars often these days with a reflective question, something to get you thinking or something which reflects a question that might be on your mind, the kind of thing that I get asked or we talk about. So our big question for today is, how do you feel about teaching phonics to learners with more complex special educational needs and disability? And there's no right or wrong answer for that question. It really is just to get you thinking about yourself and how you feel about this situation. And when you have a big question like that, it can unravel lots of other questions. So here are some examples of things I get asked. If you're watching this on replay, watching it later on, or you're sharing this with colleagues, it's a really great idea to pause the recording and then you can reflect or discuss one or more of these questions. So you might just pick one question, you might pick a couple of questions, but see, these are some of the things you might want to talk about as a staff. What if a learner is non-verbal? Can I still teach them phonics? What if I follow the program, but they still don't seem to be making progress? Am I doing it wrong if I adapt how I deliver a lesson? How do I know whether to slow down or stick to the pace that the program recommends? What if the learner doesn't seem to remember the letter sounds at all? How can I keep phonics meaningful for learners with very limited cognitive understanding? What if phonics seems to cause frustration or disengagement? Am I confident enough with phonics myself to support a learner with SEND? How do I balance phonics with all the other support and interventions the learner needs? And is it fair to expect my learners to access the same phonics program, or should they have something completely different? So what are we talking about then when we think about SEND, in particular in this session? Well, special educational needs and disabilities refers to a broad spectrum of needs. And in this session, we are thinking very broadly. We're focusing on learners with more complex profiles, those who might need more significant adaptation. We ran a webinar back in July, and I'm sure there'll be a recording floating around about that one. You can request it from Hachette, where we looked at intervention. So we were looking at learners who might have additional needs or who might need catch-up support, but not as extreme as in these cases. But we're delving sort of more into it now. Complex needs may include cognitive difficulties, communication needs, sensory processing issues, or physical needs. So there's a really, really wide range of what those needs can be. We're also thinking about learners that could be 4 years old, or they could be 19 years old. And we have a lot of specialist provisions actually that use Rocket Phonics. It's really well catered for children with complex needs. And so I've tried throughout not to use the word child or children. I've tried to use the word learner because I'm referring to a really wide age range of learners. There might be young adults actually that are still needing to access some of this phonics teaching. The learners we're thinking about today could be in a mainstream school, they could be in a specialist school, they could be in an alternative provision, or they could indeed be homeschooled. Now, another thing, when I was thinking about putting together this session, I thought, shall we talk about the different diagnoses that these learners might have? Shall we be specific? Shall we talk about learners that have autism or learners that have dyslexia? Shall we talk about learners with dyscalculia? Shall we talk about learners who have dual sensory loss? And instinctively, I felt like, no, I don't want to categorize learners like that. I want to talk much more broadly, because it's really about the individual learner and what their barriers might be. And I was looking at this white paper report that came out from a company called Shift Insight Limited. And at first I thought, oh, this is really helpful, actually. Look at all of these different categories that they were doing a study about staff training, about continued professional development over the last 5 years. How confident did teachers feel? What training had they had in these different areas? So it was really interesting to look at this and see how confident people feel. For example, they feel more confident, they've had more training about learners with autism spectrum disorder, but they've had less training, they feel less confident with learners with profound and multiple learning difficulties. So at first, that was my thinking, that we could be really, really specific about these things. I thought, would that be helpful? But actually, it's not about the diagnosis, it's about their access, no matter what their diagnosis is. And working with children with complex needs, you'll know that often they have multiple issues going on, and they overlap. And so we have to really unpick, and we have to think about the learners that we are dealing with specifically. Who is it that we're helping? So we're focusing on the barriers that those individuals face when they're accessing phonics. What do they need? How can we make this content more relatable to them, more accessible to them? Diagnosis can sometimes give us useful insight. It is useful, it is interesting, but a diagnosis doesn't tell us what the teaching will look like. And that's our job today, is we're thinking about, what does that teaching look like? How can I be really effective? So we're thinking about, is the learner nonverbal? Do they have sensory processing difficulties? Are they able to sit and attend? How do they communicate their voice, their opinions, their needs, their understanding of what it is that we're doing? Can they recognize symbols? Can they match letters to sounds? Can they respond in some way? And that is really quite individual. And then when we're thinking about that, then we're thinking about the barriers, and we're thinking about the access, and thinking about what needs to happen in this teaching situation. We can reflect on, well, what is it that the learner needs to learn to be able to read and write? And to be able to read and write is huge. That's very complicated, very challenging processes. And sometimes, especially as adults who are usually quite literate, we are good at reading and writing. That's often come quite easy to us. We haven't had to worry about how challenging that might be. It's a natural process that we just sort of absorb and we pick up as we go along. And so it's good for us to reflect on and think about, well, let's unpick it, let's unravel it. You know, what needs to happen? So to become a reader or a writer, a learner typically needs to notice and remember speech sounds. They need to understand that letters represent those sounds. They need to recognize the letter shapes and link them to sounds. Know that spoken words carry meaning. Understand that sounds in words occur in a fixed order, and begin to link spoken and written words in meaningful ways. For learners with more complex needs, the skills might develop much more slowly. They might not always, I'm generalizing there, but on the whole, it's a much slower pathway to success. They might be harder to observe. We really have to notice every detail and really think about, you know, what success we're having and what that progress looks like. That progress might be there. We just don't see it as easily as we might do in a mainstream context. The skills might be learned in a different order. You might be quite surprised, actually, that the learner picks up or starts to get to grips with some of the skills, and it might be not in the order you're expecting that to be. They might be showing what they can do in subtle or unconventional ways. But a key message is that we keep going, because we believe the learning is happening, even if we can't always see it yet. And for some of us, that's a very easy mindset. We know that, we get that. It's just in tiny, tiny baby steps. But sometimes we have to have conversations where the people we're having conversations with, they might not see that yet. So we have to change a little bit of mindset. And we have to look beyond what we can see. So reading and writing are complex. They rely on interwoven cognitive, sensory, and motor processes. That's why teaching learners phonics to learners with complex SEND requires a lot of patience, a lot of precision, and consistency. Consistency is really important. Some learning happens internally. So, for example, learners with PMLD, profound multiple learning difficulties, or severe communication difficulties, that progress isn't always outwardly visible, but a lack of response doesn't mean a lack of understanding. It might be that you know your pupil well enough that you can tell, you just vibe together, you just understand that there is that progress happening, they have got some understanding. And it might be that it takes longer to get to know that pupil and to see that. And we must challenge those assumptions. So sometimes I still hear statements like, they'll never be readers, they're never going to be a real reader, you're never going to reach that level of actual reading or actual writing. That's not going to happen for these learners. But when we make statements like that, we close the doors. We've put the ceiling on, the glass ceiling. We limit what these learners can do. And some of the foundations for reading might already be there or begin to develop because we teach phonics and not before. So phonics matters for all learners. That is an important message from today. We don't rule it out for anybody. But sometimes, understandably, staff may feel unsure about whether phonics applies to certain learners. And this is a comment I hear quite frequently, especially when people have been working with learners for many years and the progress is that slow or that, not transparent, we can't see it, that they really start to question, is this working? What's the point? Why are we bothering with this? But here are some sort of key statements why it really, really matters. Reading and writing give people power. So when we can read and write, we're opening the doors to independence, communication, and identity, and that's really important. Literacy is a right, not a reward. Every child deserves the chance to access reading and writing, regardless of their diagnosis or their perceived potential. Phonics isn't about forcing learners through a system. Systematic phonics teaching gives all learners a consistent, structured path into reading and spelling, including those with complex needs. And there is actually an increasing abundance of research and studies now that shows that when learners with complex needs are supported through phonics over a long period of time, it does work in a lot of cases. So it's worth doing. There's also a lot of research out there that shows you that really phonics, it to do with sort of the way the brain learns. Actually, phonics is far more effective than trying to learn through purely sight reading. So if we just show whole words all the time and go for a word by word approach, that can also have some success, but there's a lot of research now that phonics is more consistently effective with more learners. For some, phonics will unlock the code completely. It will be like magic. And for others, it will give fragments of understanding, but those fragments still matter. That even if we just get to a limited level, that's still important. And those small steps can lead to life-changing outcomes. So the progress might look different, but every step forward, every time they recognize a symbol, they attend to a sound, they choose a word, can open new worlds. Those are huge steps for some learners. So when I talk about phonics, I always like to briefly touch upon that actually I'm talking about a little bit more than phonics. So phonics means teaching learners the relationship between the sounds, the phonemes, and the letters, the graphemes, blending to read and segmenting to spell. So when we peel back sort of what phonics is, that is the nubbins of what phonics actually is. It's the systematic teaching of the alphabetic code, the relationship between the letters and sounds and how it's used to decode or read and encode and spell words. We are applying Rocket Phonics today. We're thinking about Rocket Phonics as our program, but actually the key messages, the principles we discussed today apply to any phonics provision. So I'd love for you to sort of carry this content with you, no matter what schools you work in, no matter what programs you work with. It's really good sort of generic stuff. I want to remind you that actually Rocket Phonics is not just a phonics program. So often when I talk about phonics, I say, now remember, we're talking about phonics set in the context of a really broad and rich and varied literacy curriculum. We want engagement with books. We want the love and the enjoyment and the pleasure of books. But that's not a different thing from phonics. That can be part of the phonics as well. And Rocket Phonics does include daily reading, language development, comprehension, spelling, handwriting, and opportunities to explore vocabulary and sentence construction as appropriate for your learners. So there's loads and loads of content in there that we can dip into. So I can see that we've had a couple of comments that I do want to sort of dip into now, just sort of pause here. It's a good point for me. So Sophie reads, hello, I'm from a special school for pupils with severe and complex needs. Hello, thank you for joining us. 4 to 19 years old, there's that broad age gap. Are you planning to write high interest, low decoding books? I think the books are often too babyish and not appealing for our older learners. This is an ongoing challenge for publishers. So Hachette do have already quite a good range of sort of high-low, but yes, we would like to go much further with that. It's really challenging, but I agree, we've still got a gap in the market where we need more high-interest, low-decoding books, and that is something that we are actively working on behind the scenes. So it's a watch this space kind of area. I agree with the book scheme. Sophie reads, yes, so Emma reiterating that. At my SEND school, we have some very complex needs learners. We promote one-to-one reading and homeschool reading, but the lilac and lower level books supplied in the scheme are often not accessible or robust enough for our style of learners to be able to access. Is there any options for more robust or interesting engaging phonics resources to promote complex need engagement? Yes, in terms of there are things we can do at the moment to adapt resources, sort of leaning on you to kind of make those tweaks, but we are absolutely exploring this area and open to getting your feedback on what that can look like. So again, watch this space, and we absolutely, we hear you, we see you, we know there's a need for more. So some things about Rocket Phonics, why it already can work for learners with complex SEND, because there are things in the way that Rocket Phonics is built that actually are already working to help you that don't require adaptation. Often, things that work for children with additional need are really good for children without additional need as well. These are just good things for learners. So structure, having that cumulative nature, the way that a program builds very cumulatively and gradually, and consistency, these are aspects that are ideal for learners, particularly who need routine and predictability, and can really support staff as well when you're building those tiny steps over time. There's already lots of opportunities for overlearning and repetition, and it's likely that the more we go into complex needs, that we are looking to increase those opportunities. How can we overlearn more and more and more? How can we repeat more and more and more, but also ring the changes a little bit? Lesson content in Rocket Phonics is easily separated into bite-sized pieces, and that's something I'd look to encourage you to do more, is to see visually how lessons have got these little elements, some that you can park that aren't relevant for right now or might not be relevant at all, but some elements that you can extract or use as individual bite-sized pieces that might then create a whole lesson or a whole week of lessons. And the lesson content is pretty easily identifiable as each piece of knowledge and each skill. So what I mean by that is when we think about phonics and what phonics is, we always come back to the core knowledge and skills. It's that knowledge of the alphabetic code, the relationship between the letters and sounds, the GPCs or the grapheme-phoneme correspondences, that skill of blending, decoding or reading, that skill of segmenting, encoding and spelling. And then we can work on that knowledge and those skills at code level, at word level, at sentence level, and at text level. So we've already got a bit of a hierarchy there, a bit of a starting point, some things that follow on a bit later, and then this ability to kind of spiral round and revisit at code level, at word level, at sentence level, at text level. So for example, You might be somebody who says, for my learners, we're currently working on our code knowledge. We are specifically thinking about the first 10 GPCs, and I'm modeling some word blending. We might not be word blending, but I'm modeling it, and we are focusing on the first 10 pieces of code. That's where we're at. Somebody else might say, my learners know the simple code. They know around that first 42 GPCs, the simple code being sort of one sound, one way of spelling it. And many of them can blend simple words. Actually, we're now working on a bit of segmenting of simple words and a bit of letter formation. So balancing adaptation with fidelity, we're thinking about, we're told there are messages out in the sort of education sphere about fidelity to your phonics program. You have to show fidelity. You can't just make, chop and change and make everything completely different, but we have to be able to adapt. And Rocket Phonics was always designed with it in mind that teachers of mainstream learners and SEND learners, more complex, would adapt the content to meet the needs of their learners really specifically. And you can do that whilst also having fidelity. It is possible to have both. So adaptation means adjusting the delivery, the access, or the pace of the teaching, but you're not changing the content or the progression. You're using the content, you're using the progression as your starting points, and then you're thinking about, well, how do I deliver it and how quickly do I deliver it? Adaptation isn't abandoning the program. We're not leaving it behind and coming away from it. We're just changing how we teach and not what we teach. Fidelity means sticking to the progression, recognizing that this cumulative order is really important. That's the way that phonics works to build up the language. The sequence, so the order in which we'd go in, thinking about the sequence of how things build, and the structure. Fidelity, really importantly to me as the author, means that you embrace the ethos and the principles. So often I find with people who use Rocket Phonics, like, you get it. You, like, when I talk to you, you're like, I'm like, yes, you get it. You understand the ethos and the principles, the way that it works, the way that it's rooted around the core knowledge, and the way that it's rooted around the skills, and the way that it spirals, and the way that lessons are built, that they have access at lots of different levels for different learners at the same time. And you see, you get, on the whole, people really seem to get this idea that we don't introduce changes or adaptations that contradict, distract, or confuse. And I think I've put in here later, I really need you to dig deep on that one, because when you're working in the world of complex SEND, you potentially get loads of advice coming from loads of different people. And that is fantastic. It's really good to listen to different experiences, different advice, different opinions, but you have to make a judgment call on that advice as to whether it's going to work for your learners, or whether sometimes it's a bit distracting or a bit gimmicky, or you think, well, why is that person suggesting that I do that with my learners? Is that really helping them? And I don't want to give examples of that, because I don't want to be a negative Nelly ever about the way that somebody else might do things. But I do sometimes see things and I think, no, that's absolutely not for me. That's not going to work with the learners. So we're balancing adaptation with fidelity. We're thinking about how we teach, and we're not changing what we teach. We're maintaining that grapheme, phoneme, correspondence, progression, and some of the core routines. So adaptations can include the pace and the repetition. So what we do for each lesson per week, per year can look different. The access to the materials. So are we doing things like enlarging the text? Are we including things like tactile flashcards? The delivery format, so it might be in terms of group size and what that looks like, or it might be in terms of the session duration, keeping things nice and short, or chopping things up differently, or having things at different times on different days. The measures of success and progress, and being able to explain that to others with conviction, being able to put across to people that actually they may not see success and progress in a mainstream way on a spreadsheet, on a chart with loads of, graphs with the progress sort of shooting up to the sky. It might be really, really tiny steps of progress, but there is progress there. There are steps there. And then timescales and review periods. So that's something that's very common with phonics teaching, is that we're constantly reviewing, constantly reflecting on what is working, and then making sort of tweaks and adaptations to that. And those timescales and review periods might look very different in your context. You might be reviewing every week because that learner is changing every week. You might be reviewing far less often because you're not expecting that progress to happen in 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks. You're expecting that progress to happen. Although you obviously keep an eye on it all the time, you're expecting the progress to happen over sort of 6 weeks. And you see flashing up in the comments there about tactile flashcards. We don't produce tactile flashcards. I mean that as an adaptation that either you would make to ones that you download and print yourself, or that you have tactile flashcards that you can incorporate and use alongside, things like the sandpaper flashcards that a lot of settings have. So adapting the pace. One of the things that I like to use when we talk about pace with phonics in all contexts, mainstream and specialist provision, is a progression map. So if you've heard me talk before about a progression map, this is a progression map. And a progression map shows how quickly you will introduce, how quickly you're going to work through the content of a phonics program. And across the top chart there, we've got mainstream teaching, typically in the reception year or the first year of formal phonics teaching. And each of the columns is showing you a half a term, so a 6-week block. And it's showing you which letter sounds we're going to introduce and which common exception words and which colour band we're working on for reading. So you can get a really good sense of expectation. So during that reception year, we expect actually the vast majority of children on a mainstream pathway to be working on pink and have covered all of those letter sounds and those common exception words in the first 2 half terms. After Christmas, we would expect children in reception to be moving to red level and moving to the next sort of batch of sounds and the next batch of words. Not the same for all children. So what we can do with a progression map is show what that looks like for them by, for example, slowing it down. So the child A example at the bottom of the screen has been slowed down to half the pace, so 50% of the pace. So here, instead in a half term of introducing 12 letter sounds, for example, we're just introducing 6 for that whole 6 weeks. And this is the progress that we anticipate that this learner might make. It might be even slower than that. You might be working on, for example, Sapin, the first 6 letter sounds, for half a year, or you might be working on that for even longer. It absolutely depends on your learners. But by laying it out, we're showing what do we think it's going to look like, and then it can help you map out, well, how far do we think we're going to get across different years and time periods? Do Hachette have pre-made progression maps available alongside the schemes for mainstream, e.g. first steps, or is it something we make? Progression maps are in your teacher handbooks. It will lay out the progression maps as sort of individual progress maps, and there are things laying this out as an expectation. A mainstream child, this is the expectation of how this would look. They are also available there's an intervention guide, and in the intervention guide, it sort of lays out how it can look. You would need to make it to adapt your progression map. So if you're going to do a slowed down progression map, that's really personal to you, and it might change over time. So you might take the child A example that you've created. You've slowed down the standard mainstream progression map that exists out there. You've slowed it down yourself, but actually you might get halfway through that and then rethink it. So we're not going to put expectations on you of how it should look for learners with additional needs. You're making the adaptations. I hope that makes sense. Great. So here's an example. We've been working on Sapin for a whole year. Now, this is a really good question. I do get asked this quite a lot, actually. We've been working on Sapin for a whole year with our learner. Do we keep repeating Sapin over and over and over again, or do we move on? Because it's getting really boring and they're not making the progress with it. So we need to do something to make it different. We're wondering whether phonics is even working. And I'm saying, yes, keep with it, have faith, keep persevering. But actually, do we always stay in the sat pin bucket, or do we move on? And I really try to encourage you to think about both. So at the end of the day, you're the one who's going to know your learner the best. But I would encourage you to do both of stay within, for example, sat pin, stay where the learners are at, and you're really trying to aim for some mastery and some independence and having embedded learning, but do not hold back from some further knowledge and skills as appropriate. So you're not going to go with a sat pin learner and start also dual teaching way further through the program. That would be way too much. But actually, you can start to do more with them, because sometimes I've found, and people have found, that actually after a really long period of time, things start to click and fall into place. And if they've been exposed to further content, they can make quite a big jump. Like it was all going in, we just didn't realize it. So I would always move on with more, and I would do modeling the next level of steps. So the next bit of blending and the next bit of segmenting. And remember that Rocket Phonics is about multi-layer lessons. Even for mainstream children, the content always has things that some of them will be able to access now, but some of them can't access now. That's a bit for later. It's or some of it they can do independently, but some of it they need support with. Because in a mainstream context, we're dealing with classes of children who are working at multiple levels. So that idea of some things that they're working on right now, their absolute focus, it might be one letter sound, and also a little bit of more. We have groups who maintain fidelity through the sequence and ethos, but the sounds will be bespoke to that group of children based on their assessments. So miss out some sounds that they already know. Is that okay? Yes, that sounds exactly what I'm talking about, that actually you're following the sequence, you get the ethos, but also you're fine-tuning it and you're making it really bespoke to what those learners need. Perfect. That's that duality, that's that balance of giving them exposure to more, appreciating the sequence, but also really honing in on exactly what they need. And it's complicated, isn't it, with children who have additional needs or children who join later on, this idea of gap filling. On the whole, if children have got quite a few gaps, I say don't agonize over gap filling, go back to an earlier point, even if it's easier, and work systematically through. But actually, when you have learners who some has stuck, some hasn't stuck, there are clear gaps, that precision teaching is really useful, really sort of picking out which bits we need to work on. How do we support a learner who cannot retain sounds? We've been working on SATPIN since last year, and she is unable to retain and recognize. It's the holy grail search, isn't it? It's that keep on reflecting and looking at different ways to present the same information. Unfortunately, there is no magic answer for it, and I absolutely wouldn't say abandon it. I would say work on a few other sounds as well to sort of, you know, increase interest and keep more sort of potential going on there. But it's keep working on it, and it might take you not even just another year, it might take you a couple more years. But what's your alternative? Is the alternative that we say it's not sticking, they're not retaining it, let's not bother? Because if they're not retaining a letter sound, it's equally unlikely that they're going to retain a whole word with that conceptual understanding of that word. They might, learners are very different, but phonics is the route to giving more independence, because if we just go, for example, word by word by word, they might build up a little small repertoire of words, but they won't ever have the skill to independently access new words that they haven't yet encountered. So keep at it and have that sort of blind faith. So thinking about adapting the pace. In Rocket Phonics for mainstream, this little example on the screen of a teaching and learning cycle is typically one lesson. So this is your lesson. You would start the lesson with revisit and review. You might do some flashcards. You would teach the content using your big book spread. You would practice and apply using your pupil practice booklet. And you would use your target practice reading book, whether that's on a one-to-one small group or as a whole class. You would use your decodable readers to support as well. When I talk about sometimes things like intervention within a mainstream context, we might play with this pace and we might say, well, could a child on intervention do some pre-teaching, some overlearning, Could they revisit some of this on another day of the week? Could they revisit some of this in the afternoon? How can we split this up? How can we play with this structure whilst still sort of keeping the ethos of this structure? And when we think about children with more complex needs, we can play with this structure even more. One of the things that I often recommend is that we take this teaching and learning structure and we look at this not as one lesson or one day, but this might be one entire week. So Monday, you might do some work on revisit and review. Tuesday, you might teach something new. Mondays are good for revisit and review because you can do spaced retrieval. What did we do last week? Have they retained anything over the weekend? Tuesday might be teach. Wednesday might be practice. Thursday might be apply. Friday might be consolidate or some further application. You might repeat that entire cycle with the exact same content for a second week. Or you might take that cycle and spread that over a fortnight. You might do a couple of days of revisit and review before you do a couple of days on teaching and thinking about something new. So that's a really useful thing to think about, that teaching and learning cycle and how we can stretch out that pace and adapt it to meet needs. This is a chart just showing if we're thinking about adapting pace, we're playing with that it's going to take us longer. We're going to work more slowly through the content, what that might look like over several years. And if you have learners that are coming to, say, 4 to 19, there's nothing wrong with that the phonics isn't crammed in to a couple of years like it is in mainstream. We've got to bust away from this, oh, phonics is what we do when they're in infants. Phonics should be finished by the time they're 7 or 8. Then we move on to sort of wider literacy skills. Phonics can continue, and I would continue phonics with mainstream children all the way through their primary years and into their secondary years, because phonics, when we get to advanced phonics and complex spellings, is really hard and complex. And I think we can do much more with our learners for much longer. But there's no rule that says that you have to fit phonics into, for example, the infants or into even the primary years. So first column here, looking at mainstream. A mainstream pathway is that you would use perhaps first steps, the nursery resources first in sort of the nursery age. In reception, the first year of formal schooling, you might cover 60 letter sounds following year 1 of Rocket Phonics. The next year, in year 1, second year of formal schooling, we'll cover 70 grapheme phoneme correspondences. That's 130 in those 2 years. That's incredible. And then in year 2 or beyond, you would look at the next steps part of the programme. Well, here's a couple of examples where actually maybe we use the first steps materials across 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. And I know there'll be those of you who use this with more complex learners flexibly across any amount of years or with any age group. And then actually you might look with your classes to do 30 pieces of code, 30 grapheme phoneme correspondences a year, or 20 or 10. So it's interesting to look at how that maps out over the years. And it might form part of the kind of conversation that you have on a management level as your school. If external visitors come to your school and ask about the phonics, that you say, yes, in our school, we do teach phonics. We do use that as one of our sort of literacy approaches. And the children, we expect them to have covered X amount of phonics, e.g. 130 graphemes, across 8 years with us. Our programme maps out for 8 years, and that's absolutely fine to do. And we're thinking it's going to take longer, but we will get there. We will give our learners the opportunity to cover this content. Now, working with specialist provisions, as children get older, so when we're talking about our teenagers, I absolutely understand that sometimes there are other priorities. Sometimes we're looking at life skills, functional skills. There's sometimes a little bit of a shift, but I would still fight the corner for a little bit of this if possible. So this is what I already said about adapting the pace, what that might look like through the week, about how you might have at the top is the mainstream Monday, Tuesday pattern of letter sound with blending, letter sound with segmenting, 2 sounds a week. And then at the bottom, I'm showing how it just would spread out more, excuse me, through the week by introducing 1 new letter sound and using that through. So a few examples then of adaptation. So things we might do, thinking about our mnemonic system. I get asked this. In our school, we have other ways of introducing the letter sounds. Is that okay or not? Can we use our communication symbols, our visual cueing? Can we use our Makaton? Can we adapt the way that we do this? A mnemonic system is a way to help learners remember the letters and the sounds. So to just show them a letter, even for mainstream children, is a bit mind-blowing. We need something to hang that on. And so in Rocket Phonics, we use a key picture and a word, and we have an optional ditty and an action that we built into first steps. I do recommend that you keep the key picture mnemonic system, even if it sits slightly more in the background. So I would keep the is linked with mouse, but actually, by all means, I would simplify or adapt the ditty words to suit your learners. So the things that you're saying when you introduce the sounds, you can absolutely adapt that and change it to suit your needs. You might use, for example, the first steps flashcards to incorporate the photographic images, particularly thinking actually about older learners where you might want something more photographic, you might want less of the illustration, you want it to look a little bit more mature, or thinking about children who might need more support with vocabulary and conceptual understanding. That might be more useful to use those cards. If you want to replace the actions with your visual cueing system, whatever you use in your school, that's absolutely fine, or merge the two. But what's important is that you agree and communicate any tweaks and changes across your school so that you can retain consistency and avoid confusion between classes. What you don't want is that one class is doing it one way and another class is doing it another way. It's generally considered very good practice to have a consistency and therefore have that communication and agree. In our school, this is the way that we do it, and have that kind of shared information. Other things you can do to adapt materials. So I, even in a mainstream context, would do a lot of these things as well, just to give me flexibility. Download, print, and cut flashcards into matching cards. I think flashcards are so underrated. There's so much we can use them for. You can do loads of matching activities, matching the grapheme to the picture, matching the lowercase to the capital letter, matching the same things together, just finding matching pairs. You might want to remove the capital letter so that you can just focus on the lowercase shape, and that's absolutely fine. You might want to remove the picture and the capital letter to encourage recognition of just that lowercase grapheme without those supports, because sometimes learners, as they're getting older, they rely too much on the picture. So they might look at this and say sun, and you want them to just say, but they're absolutely embedded with the sun. So yes, do sort of chop and move and take away or add as appropriate. You can also use the flashcards, the freeze as flashcards. So the freeze has letter formation. So if that's useful, if you have learners that are accessing, sort of forming the letters, or you're just modeling to them, you're just showing them, that can be useful because it gives them a visual of what that formation looks like. You can use the freeze as laminate dry wipe cards, so, and Play-Doh cards and tactile cards and things with laces and threading. You can make adaptations like that. And I would print out different sizes of flashcards according to the need or activity. So extra large or pocket size, individual size. There is nothing wrong with using other plain, simple flashcards. I wouldn't mix packs of flashcards from different schemes where you've got different styles, different branding, different illustrations, different phrases and ditties. That would be considered sort of muddling. But absolutely, if you have, for example, a set of flashcards with the sandpaper on, definitely use those. If you have the, there are some boards and they have like a little silver ball and you can roll the ball around the shape. Absolutely, any resources like that are complementary and not contradicting your Rocket Phonics. Now, massively underrated, I think, is the pupil practice booklet. Often when we think about children with really complex needs, the booklet is the first thing we want to park. We want to go, no, these children cannot access a worksheet. Let's get rid of the worksheet. Do not use the booklet. No, no, no. Everything needs to be tactile and bigger and colourful. And this is kind of the thing that people tend to abandon. And I'm saying, People, this is the absolute starting point. This is the core resource. This has the exact resources and activities that you need. You just need to see it in a different way. You don't want to reinvent the wheel. You can look to this booklet and look to these activities as the things that you can do, but you can just deliver them in a different way. So you can see that this page from a booklet has different boxes. These are different sections and they have different skills attached to these sections. You can reproduce these as individual tasks. So you can extract and use the different parts separately. You might extend each task for varied repetition. You might use the sort of extended or separated or individual tasks from here instead of the booklet. So you're using the content, but you're not doing it in the booklet. Or you might do both. You might do a bit in the booklet and you might have it presented in different ways. You can use grapheme and picture cards or manipulable objects, so things like magnetic cards as well to complement. You can use your tactiles, your sandpaper letters, your Play-Dohs, but you're always asking yourself, looking at a box, looking at an activity, what is the intention? What is the purpose? So section 1, for example, actually what it is that we're asking the learners to do there is recognize and distinguish between letters and symbols, upper and lower case. So that's quite a lot going on there for some of our learners, actually. So you can think, right, if the purpose is to recognize and distinguish between letters and symbols, perhaps another way of presenting this is I'm going to use the cards. I'm going to use the picture of the sun from the flashcard. I'm going to use the part of the flashcard with this. Do I want capital letters or do I just want the lowercase? And you could turn that into an activity where you are giving 2 options. So you have 2 laid out on the table in front of you. You have the picture of the sun and you have the lowercase s. And you might call out and say, point to the sun. Point to the s. Point to the s. Point to the s. And you're building up anticipation. Anticipation. Can they recognize? Can they distinguish? Of course, you have to adapt it in terms of thinking about how they communicate to you, how they're going to express that to you. But you can take the essence of that task and you can simplify it, or you can extend it, or you can look at how you can repeat it. Section 2, what is it that we're asking them to do? What is the intention of that task? What is the purpose? They're grapheme searching. They're looking for the shape. Now, it might be that that's far too small for them to be able to access and see in that sentence. Oh, excuse me. So you might want to extract that sentence and write it on a big piece of paper or type it out or have it on a screen. Excuse me. In them grapheme searching and looking through that sentence, we're getting them to distinguish between the different letter shapes. So we're getting them to find the shape and we don't want them to find the other shapes. So actually, an alternative to that, okay, I can lay out some cards. I'm going to reduce the cognitive load. I would like my learner to distinguish between a s and an a. And it might be that you're not going to check about the a. You might not say which one is a because we haven't formally covered that yet. That's not been introduced. We're focusing on s, but you might say which one is s. Yes, no. You might do a yes, no for that one. So again, thinking about the essence of what it is. Section 3 here is looking at motor control, association, saying and hearing as you say the sound and match it to the picture, and excuse me, the vocabulary of those objects. Same with section 4. We've got motor control, association, saying and hearing, and the vocab. But it might not be appropriate for your learners to access it in that way. So how are they going to express it? So you might still use that part. You might have it enlarged. You might have it as cards or as objects for touching. It might be about using a finger to associate and to connect. It might be about just saying or just listening. You might be doing something like, pass me the color, or which color do you think that I should use? Or you might develop it more into a sensory story. So this picture here, we're just identifying items that begin with a sound. hang on, I know a great book that's got loads of sound, so I might use a decodable and think more about in terms of sensory story. So something that you can do, again, as a staff training activity or a good collaborative activity, is take something like this one page and discuss together how many ways can you adapt this content specifically appropriate to your learners. And of course, I mean, I can see in the chat there's sort of questions about, what do we already have? Is there anything available currently about making the practice booklets more age appropriate for SEN? And something that, as we go more into this area, that's something that we're really interested to explore with you and get your feedback. And there'll be some things that aren't viable for publishers because they're so expensive to produce. And there'll be other things that are absolutely genius that we can do to facilitate. So let me just have a little look more through some questions here. Anything from Hachette for phonics, understanding below letter progressions, something to follow for the teaching of prerequisite skills, environmental sounds. Yes, First Steps has got loads of materials on environmental sounds, instrumental sounds, body percussion, etc. There's an absolute plethora of materials in there. And again, as we develop more into the SEND world, that's something that we will look to continue that ethos, but up level the age view of some of those things. After using flashcards, then we use the booklets for perfection, and for practice, we provide the worksheet for clarification. Absolutely, booklets are really, really useful still. Same question about prerequisite skills, what is available. Currently, it's your First Steps is where you'll find all of that. And also in Rocket Phonics, there's a lot on speech rhythms. So there's speech rhythm work, working with pattern and working with speech. So that might be appropriate. Sophie reads, we will absolutely love to collaborate with you. Please be in touch. Even objects could probably give the good impact. Yes, absolutely. You can add to this with objects and pictures as appropriate. Right, let me romp on because you know what I'm like for time. I always overrun. Another thing that you can adapt for now, and we will look at adapting more with you and for you in the future, are the assessments. So at the moment in Rocket Phonics, it really looks at that at the end of every sort of 6-week period, you would assess how the children have done with that content. And you can still use these assessments, but of course your timescales are likely to be very different. So you're likely to want to cross off half term 1, cross off reception, and it might be that that assessment document isn't for a fixed period in time. You might use that over an entire year, or you might, dip into that every now and then. And a reminder, there are also those individual progress trackers that show you in a mainstream context, here is the progression. That progression is still quite relevant, but actually, again, scrap those timescales. We're working on individual timescales. And that's not really something that we can provide for you because it is so individual for one learner with one diagnosis, with one presentation of needs. That might take 6 months, but for another learner, it might take 4 years. It's that varied. There's no expectation on what that needs to look like. So some core principles to keep. Stick with the Rocket Phonics sequence of grapheme phoneme correspondences. Don't abandon that, although you can precision teach, you can pick where you need to work on. Still think about using daily blending and segmenting routines, tons of modeling, all the time, tons of modeling. Even if you think that that's having no value, we still just model it. We talk like in the same way that we model how much we love reading and we read by reading all the time. We model these routines and these processes. Teach to mastery before moving on too far, but don't hold back. Do both. And think of it as a spiral. We are always revisiting our old content at the same time as moving on to a bit of new content. Repetition with variation supports memory. So we're thinking all the time about how can we repeat the same stuff with a little bit of variation, but actually routine and repetition to help the memory. Aim to simplify and not overcomplicate and not distract. So we're not trying to make things harder for ourselves. We're not trying to make things harder for the learners. We're actually trying to simplify all the time. Consistently across the school, do add in your communication systems, things like your Macatum, things like your visual cues, but try not to distract or confuse. So think about how compatible those systems are, how you can overlay them in a way that works. And then this is the thing I mentioned earlier, dig deep with your reflection and your evaluation of a method. Is it a gimmick if someone's presented to you something like, oh, there's this great way of doing things, the learners can do this, that, and the other? Will that work? Is it closely linked to what it is that we want the learners to do? Does it facilitate the access, or is it something that's going to be complicated? A few common challenges and then a few strategies, and it's very oversimplified, but it's just giving you some ideas. For learners with limited attention span, we're thinking about micro sessions, short routines. That is absolutely fine. Keep things really, really short and sweet. For memory difficulties, daily repetition, visual prompts, and that repetition might be repetition over a really long period of time. For limited motor control, we can use pointing, we can use matching tasks. For non-verbal communication, we can use augmentative and alternative communication systems, high-tech or low-tech. We can use symbol support, we can use signing. Importantly, and I haven't really touched upon this today because the time gets away from me, it goes so fast. Disengagement or frustration, we must always put at the heart of what we do the learner's well-being. So I just do want to say that loud and clear, that if we have learners who are disengaged or frustrated, it's not that we're going to abandon what we're doing, but we're going to take a back step and reflect about how they are feeling about what we're doing and whether we just need to slow it down, step away from it, do something that they really enjoy. I just wanted to sort of mention that one, that we don't kind of bullishly push this. We have to put their well-being at the heart of it. But of course, we can look at other approaches, multi-sensory input, building loads of success early, loads of positive praise. And if we have sensory processing difficulties, we can be really flexible about seating. There's a lot of information about phonics teaching, which is correct, that as far as is possible, learners should be seated at an appropriate height desk, in an appropriate height chair, with comfort, with good lighting, with good pencil hold, with 2 feet on the floor, with our shoulders square to the desk. But of course, as soon as we have additional needs and challenges, we do need to be more flexible about that. So we can aim for that, but we can be really flexible about what is possible to achieve and what that looks like for our learners. And we try to reduce distractions as much as possible. So coming towards the end then, a little example, supporting a child with PMLD. Imagine our learner is 8, they have profound and multiple learning difficulties, limited mobility, no spoken language, they have significant visual impairment. They are engaged, they do engage through touch, sound, and rhythm. So touch, sound, and rhythm, these are our ways in. This is what we're going to look to adapt our material with. And they learn best through sensory repetition and routines. So for our adapted use of Rocket Phonics, we might choose our focus grapheme phoneme correspondence, e.g. and we might repeat that for 2+ weeks. We might have a plan that we are going to repeat it for 2 weeks and then we're going to move to something else. Or we might be a bit flexible and we might repeat it for a couple of weeks, but then we might extend that for another week, or we might change after 1 week because we feel like we've exhausted what we're doing and want to change it. We were going to use things like our textured flashcard for that GPC. So things like our sandpaper letters, our raised edges, tactile shapes, whatever you do. I'm going to try and keep things vertical as well, rather than horizontal. A tip is to try and keep things vertical. We're going to link the sound to vibration or a drum beat. So humming with vibrations. The adult's going to use that sound in songs, familiar phrases, and during sensory story times with the Rocket Phonics, and adding in other things as appropriate, or as we are inspired, or as we have the materials available. We might share the big book story with the narrator audio. And it's nice to have that change of voice. So we can use our familiar voice, as well as we can bring some different experience with the narrator voice available on the audio. And we'll use it as a sensory story and add to it with tactile objects. What can we find that's in the story that we can add to our experience with tactile objects? And if you're not very familiar with sensory stories, get researching, go and attend some webinars on sensory stories, because they're really, really fabulous and really rewarding to create yourselves as well. We might share the decodable book, The Mat, and we might use that as a sensory story with a tactile mat, real objects. We're repeating that sound modeling, and we're having the pause for response moments, remembering that it's important. And I'm classic for somebody who doesn't pause enough. I've always got too much to say and not enough time to say it in, but it's really important to have those pause times for longer than we might think we need to give opportunity to respond. And some progress that we might see with this learner: anticipating the sound in familiar routines. That's that importance of that repetition, of building that anticipation. Showing consistent responses to the target sound over time. And that might be over quite a long time. It might be eye movement, it might be some vocalization, it might be some stilling. Building a positive connection with the book shared, because remember, phonics and those phonics knowledge and skills isn't mutually exclusive. It's not separate from really enjoying and experiencing, you know, the wonder and the love and the awe of a book as well. Oh, I've frozen. I'm so sorry, everybody. My screen's frozen. Oh, I can't get it to move. Bear with me. Oh, well. I can't get my screen to move, everybody. I'm so sorry. I hope I haven't actually frozen and that you can still see and hear me. My mouse has stopped working. I don't think it's the battery. My keyboard stopped working. Tech issue. But the good news for you is that we are at 3:11 anyway. So that's our hour. And all that I really had at the end was a bit of a summary. So it would have been a bit of me repeating and saying, you know, thanks for coming. I hope you enjoyed it. Oh, you can still hear me. That's good. So can you just check then, hosts, are there any questions? There were some things popping up in the chat there that I would have come back to just to have a scan through. And I think you've been catching everything. I think a lot of people saying thank you, they're going. Thank you. I really appreciate your feedback. And I really appreciate, I think somebody did say earlier, can we do some more of these kind of webinars? Definitely, we would like to do more of these for you. Really nice to touch base. Thank you for those of you who are up for helping us to work further on materials. Do let us know topics. So do get in touch by Facebook or with your sales reps. Everyone's quite connected, so the messages do get back to let us know the kind of topics that you would like to touch base on. And I hope that a lot of this was reassuring for you. Often when I speak to people, they say, that was really reassuring because we are doing loads of that stuff already. It's just really nice to hear that that's okay to do. Thank you, everybody. The recording will be sent out to you automatically. So you will receive the recording, and by all means, please share it with staff, watch it back, discuss things with staff, see what it brings up for you. Yes, absolutely, further adaptations, and then share that information with us, because that will give us guidance on how we can support through the publishing route to make adaptations as well. Because I do think it's a kind of, it's an area in education that hasn't been worked on enough and hasn't been developed enough. And I think we can do lots.